Pozdravljeni vsi skupaj, hvala, ker ste potrpeli z nami, da smo našli predavalnico. Mi je žal, da se je to zgodilo in bom zdaj čisto kratek. Lucija Balikić je doktorska študentka na CEU. Tema, o kateri bo pa danes govorila, je pa pravzaprav bila njeno magistrsko delo na univerzi v Zagrebu. Ona je sicer magistrirala v Zagrebu in na CEU. To, o čemer bo danes govorila, je sicer izšlo tudi pred kratkim v knjigi, ki je šla v hrvaščini pri založbi Srednja Europa. Govorila bo torej o odnosu britanskih in pa francoskih liberalcev do Avstrije oziroma do nastanka Jugoslavije v času Prve svetovne vojne. Zdaj, zaradi časovne stiske je res kar končam. Lucija, beseda je tvoja, predavanje pa bo seveda v angleščini.
Thank you very much, Rok, and thank you for coming. It's a real pleasure to talk to you today about this topic. I will try to be a bit briefer than I planned, but I think we will fit, and ideally we could have maybe one or two questions if anyone wants before we leave. So this is obviously a larger topic, right, on the occasion of the publication of the book, as Rok just mentioned. And I just want to give you a brief structure of my talk. So first I would just like to say a few words about the book so you know the context a bit. Then I would like to give you a brief historiographical overview of what are the best works about this topic that I used and that I consider historiographically the most useful. And also I want to do some conceptual clarification in the sense that I say what are my definitions of who I understand as British or French liberals exactly, what is integral Yugoslavism in this context, what is the idea of New Europe, and so on. Okay, and also I want to then talk a bit about the political and associational culture that serves for me as a context in which these discourses operated that we will see, and towards the end I will mention a few key individuals and their main works. The focus will be on one person because we don't have too much time even originally, so this person is of course Robert William Seton Watson, the most active in this group, and also I will talk a bit about his discourse, the key ideological tropes that he used when he was talking about Southern Slavs or when he was talking about Austria-Hungary. And in the end, if we have time, it would be great to have Q&A. So to start about just a few words about the book. So as you can see, the book just came out like 2 months ago or 1 month ago. It's called, in English I translated it as Best Intentions, British and French Intellectuals and the Creation of Yugoslavia. So you can see that actually the question of intentionality is central to this book, and which is obviously one of the huge questions in intellectual history, but generally it's something that I wanted to spark a discussion with, because this is really one of those things that is open-ended, and it's something that we can, I think, endlessly discuss. What was the intention behind many of these books that were published, between, establishing of all those tropes and discourses and all the things that happen in this context. So it's based, as Rok said, on my 2 MA theses that I defended at University of Zagreb. Also, I spent a considerable amount of time at University of Southampton in the UK, where I did a bulk of this research on the British part of the story. And there was a second MA, which then more focused on the French part of the story, which I did at CEU. And I also did additional research in the subsequent years after these 2 MAs, and then it all came together. So I was inspired to write this, or to choose this as my MA topics, and then to additionally work on it by the First World War centenary, obviously, between 2014 and 2018. These were very, very debated questions. I oftentimes felt that the way this is treated in Yugoslav historiographies is a bit of parochial, in the sense that the creation of Yugoslavia, of course for obvious political and ideological reasons of the present day, was often presented as either a result of great power politics, so something where there is no agency of South Slavic intellectual elites and no agency of generally of some kind of intellectuals, or on the other hand, a will, kind of predetermined outcome of the will of the local political elites. And I was always interested to see, actually, to go beyond that and to see something else. So I wanted to show this transnational intellectual context of the story. So that's why this book kind of includes this complex conversation between the South Slavic intellectuals and British and French ones, basically from the turn of century towards the end of the First World War. Let's say 1920 would be the concluding year, so I also include a bit the peace conference as well. And I wanted to respond to the following questions, which you can see here. So, how did integral Yugoslavist intellectuals propagate their political claims to British and French liberals? So, how did they actually sort of teach them the language of integral Yugoslavism? And on the other hand, how did these liberals, which were, by the way, mostly scholars or journalists, how did they convince the public opinion of their countries and their respective governments to adopt a policy that would go towards the destruction of Austria-Hungary? As you probably know, right, this was not the case from the beginning at all. So there is a shift in the middle of the war, or towards the middle of the war, where they start adopting it more and more as something they should really concentrate on, rather than any other battles and so on. So obviously, I was interested in how did they explain actually this, the need to create such a state as Yugoslavia. How did they articulate it? In which terms? What kind of ideological background was behind this kind of negotiations, especially between the said intellectuals, not so much between the politicians, because obviously politicians had different things to think about at that time. So the main sources I used for this were British and French scholarly and propagandistic publications. So mainly different kinds of periodicals that were published back then, also books, so many like scholarly books from the fields of, like Slavic studies, geography, history, and so on. And also many propagandistic booklets that were published in this period, so again from the turn of century towards 1920, about Austria-Hungary and Yugoslavia. And also I used some archival material, for example Seton Watson's papers, and also Foreign Office files from the British Archives, which were all very interesting. So just to give a brief historiographical overview, I just outlined several. Of course there is much more, but these are just some that for me were either useful or somehow contributed to this. So on the picture, the man there was no publication I could, because he doesn't have a book about this, he just has a series of very long and excellent articles. He is Vojislav Pavlović, the director of the Balkanology Institute at Serbian Academy of Sciences, who in some part of his career has been dealing with this topic about 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and he did much of the archival research that actually was not done. So on this relationship between the Yugoslav Committee and the French diplomacy, but also in intellectual terms. So it was not so much useful for its interpretation, to be very honest, but actually for the raw data which exists nowhere else. Same thing with the following one, Francusko i Hrvatsko pitanje, by the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Croatia, Miro Kovač, who also recently published a new book about a very similar topic, just that is more focused on the interwar period. Which was also, again, this book, you must understand, is obviously in the very 1990s kind of interpretation of, Croatian statehood and kind of Yugoslavia being some kind of, second prison of peoples after Austria-Hungary and so on. So I didn't concentrate on that because this book has more merits in the fact that when he studied for his PhD in Paris, he acquired a really good amount of archival material and sketched these relationships similar to the previous person I now mentioned. And the third book I put on the slide, Great Britain and Austria-Hungary during the First World War, which is from the 70s, is actually one of the best books, Harry Hanak. So this is really also cultural a bit, so he goes into these long descriptions of cultural events that happened in London and Paris around this time that gave people the sense of what this Yugoslavia is culturally and so on. And for me that was very interesting. And he also literally excavated so much material about this different associations for propagandistic and for propaganda and agitation that were founded around this period in Britain. And then, of course, Mark Cornwall's very classic, The Undermining of Austria-Hungary, The Battle for Hearts and Minds, which is, needless to say, great and focuses on propaganda, especially inter-allied propaganda. And the last, James Evans's book, Great Britain and the Creation of Yugoslavia, where he goes in a very sophisticated analysis of what was actually the decising factor, how did these British people actually understand the Yugoslav agenda, and so this is what I recommend if you're interested in this topic. Briefly, what are the main concepts I'm using? So, of course, the main thing I'm using is integral Yugoslavism. This is the ideology I'm arguing that was transferred from the political language of the South Slavic political elites, of the South Slavic intellectuals, to the British and French liberal ones. So I understand it as ideology that supposes that all South Slavic peoples constitute a singular racial, ethnic, national, linguistic, or cultural community. So it's never, always the focus is on something different. Not everybody understands it so comprehensively. And this community is seen as being divided by history, but reunited in their heroic struggle in the First World War. And of course, many proponents of this ideology, broadly understood, right, acknowledge the existence of certain cultural differences, mainly linguistic, for example, right? But at the same time, they are more future-oriented and saying that this nation will reassert itself and the cultural differences will blend into each other, and this will be facilitated in the new state that is now forming. So in the sense, for them, it's a matter of technicality. It's a scientific fact for them that Yugoslavs are one community, and based on that scientific fact, they should be awarded a nation state, which will again then facilitate to kind of remove this layer of differences that were imposed by different historical experiences, being part of different imperial structures and so on. So who I understand as British and French liberals, again, these are mostly scholars, like most of them are people who work in Slavic studies, historians, geographers, interesting number of classical philologists, and also there are some archaeologists as well, actually, and journalists. So for me, these are thinkers who espouse liberal arguments and political ideas, but in fact they were not members of liberal parties, or what you could define as liberal parties, whether their name says it or not. So most of them are not actually included in any kind of officially political structure. They can also be conceptualized as proponents of liberal empire. So for me this is really important because they never renounce imperialism when it comes to Britain and France. They just see a problem in Austria-Hungary. And it's also interesting important to understand actually that these people these British and French liberals, especially in the British case, are at the same time, when they are writing about Austria-Hungary, they are engaged in redefining and reconfiguring British Empire. So these are exactly the people who are engaged in the so-called Round Table Society, from which was informal scholarly society in this period, from which they kind of debated the idea of Commonwealth and really articulated it, and so on. So for me, these are not separate processes. I really think that the way they were informed about Austria-Hungary really prompted them to rethink Britain, obviously in a different way, but still, it's important to conceptually take it into consideration. And also, I understand them as what Stefan Collini calls public moralists. Many of them were also key figures in the nascent fields of public relations and international relations, which became the Chatham House later, which is important. I mean, also just epistemologically, if you think about it, that at the same time when they are thinking about how to convince people to support idea of independent Yugoslavia, they are also thinking about the methods, right? So what are the ways? And this contributes to the establishing of these fields. So it's a kind of a very interesting cross-fertilization between the topic and the science behind it, right? And the New Europe, which is key for me, of course, is the key symbolic geographic reference point. So this is the name which these British and French liberals give basically to this rejuvenated Europe, which is based on completely different principles, right? So it's very charged with ideological content. Namely, they imagine a liberal international order based on nation states and minority rights protection, so something we know in the modern age, right? And they actually meant it as an opposite concept of Mitteleuropa, which is very, very important. So they construct it as something which is opposite to German vision of Europe, which is this kind of old imperial Europe as they understand it, and so on, and which is against this kind of economic exploitation and hierarchy, so against the Drang nach Osten, which again they learned about from the Yugoslav intellectuals, so it's a very interesting circulation of an idea. And of course, this idea of New Europe was used especially in the context of the dissolution of Austria-Hungary in favor of these, as I said, science-based nation states and struggle against imperialism, power politics, right? So they are trying to think about a different kind of diplomacy, and they are very much also against non-transparent diplomacy, so secret agreements, for example, like the London Agreement in the Yugo case and so on. And this is also strictly tied with this early 19th century idea of the balance of power in Europe and so on. So they are very open about the continuity between these concepts. So briefly just about this. So all these liberal scholars, journalists, activists, they published on these issues often, and they kept in touch with many South Slavic scholars and political figures well before the war. So this is not something that only happens due to propagandistic purposes. And especially what prompted their interest in this region was the context of Bosnian annexation crisis, May coup in Serbia, which is also a very big literary event in Britain, and also Balkan Wars. So they were in close contact during the war with the Yugoslav Committee, both in Paris and in London, and also with the Serbian government, but most importantly with Masaryk, who was kind of the although obviously not a Yugoslav, a very big proponent of all these ideas, a very big agent and mediator between these two groups initially and basically throughout the war. So for the purposes of agitation and propaganda, as I said, they founded a number of associations, new journals, they organized numerous events, and they also instrumentalized the existing learned societies, for example, like Institute for Slavic Studies or things like that. So they instrumentalized, and people who were otherwise just scholars became increasingly engaged in agitating for, again, dissolution of Austria-Hungary and so on. So associations which I would kind of point out, first was the Serbian Relief Fund in 1915, which was more like a fundraising agency, we could say. Then there was a Serbian Society of Great Britain, also quite important, New Europe Society, which I mentioned, which was the Seton Watson's one, and Union of Democratic Control, which was more about checks and balances in terms of the secret agreements and transparency and so on. You will notice that there are no French here, which is because actually I couldn't locate a single one which was made before or during the war, which I find very interesting. Nevertheless, in the French case, we more openly see the politicization of the existing learned societies. The journals that I want to mention, some of them are exclusively propagandistic, some of them are scholarly, but most of them are in between. So obviously New Europe, which was very influential, not just during the war. I mean, it was published in it was established in 1916, but it was very, very influential at the peace conference itself, which is very important. It was even so influential, it had like an orange cover, that it was called the Orange Bible by the participants of the Paris conference. So that's how informative it was. Of course, Le Monde Slave, Revue des études slaves, Annales de géographie, Ligue internationale pour la défense des droits du peuple. All these were very, very also distributed in France among diplomatic circles, in political circles, scholarly ones. So this is something where many things were argued for next to the Yugoslav claims. So not just, of course, dissolution of Austria-Hungary, but there were also things, related to Czechoslovakia, Poland, Romania, different kinds of Hungary that were imagined, and so on. So really, it was very open-ended, and I think it's very interesting to read all these propositions on how to arrange this region. Events that they organized, the most famous one is Kosovo Day, that was in 1916, which was a day when in France and Britain they were supposed to do different kinds of events informing people, everyday people, so about Kosovo battle and the fight of Yugoslavs, and mostly Serbs, but also Yugoslavs for freedom. This was also in schools. So, for example, in Britain, every school had to commemorate Kosovo Day. It was, of course, on the St. Vitus Day. And there were also other things that were organized an Ivan Meštrović's exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum in 1915, which was very much for these elites, so for the political and kind of intellectual, cultural elites of London. And of course, there were also other fundraising concerts and public lectures. So this is the method in which they tried to kind of inform public opinion about these issues. So I just show you, of course, the Yugoslav Committee, which in parallel published a lot of publications on these issues, right? So they had their own so-called Bibliothek Yugoslav, where they published a lot about Yugoslav history, present, future, about culture of Yugoslavia, for example, national costumes, language, and so on. So they were, and it was exactly these people, right? I'm sure that you recognize, at least from Slovenia, Niko Županić, right, who was this very famous ethnologist, one of the founders of ethnology here, or others, I don't know. So it was also a mixed group, ideologically, Yugoslav Committee. So these are just some pamphlets. I'm sure that, or not sure, I'm sure that you know about the activities of the Yugoslav Committee, but it's just interesting the way in which they decided to distribute it. So they had two main methods. One was that they would fly with the plane over the place where the soldiers were located and then just drop these pamphlets to the field. And the second one would be to, like a play, like a gramophone, like recording somewhere close where they could hear it. So this was something that was funded by this Inter-Allied Propaganda Committee. So it was very interesting that how they were, developing all these new strategies of getting people to desert from the Austro-Hungarian army. And you can see on this pamphlet, what does it say, right? It says that only you are the last ones defending the Austro-Hungarian clique. Why are you saving that corpse? So kind of to get them to give up and to cross over. Although obviously in the Yugoslav case, it's not like in the Czechoslovak case that there was an actual league that they could join, but they could join Serbian army, which of course was a different story. So here are just some posters that you can see that are related. So you can see Kosovo Day posters from France and Britain, and also the poster for the exhibition of Meštrović in the Victorian Albert Museum. And here also some other ones, just to show you. So there were others not just related to Kosovo Day, but for example, propagating, like Karađorđević dynasty, or things like that, like some relief funds for children, and so on. And now here are just the most important journals also that I mentioned. So the Slav, this is from the 30s. I couldn't find an earlier picture, but and then this is the New Europe, which I said was the most important one. So just to briefly sketch the end of this context part, so most of them actually were kept out of the state institutions until the very, very end of the war. So only somewhere in 1918, when it became obvious that but when politicians really adopted this policy that, okay, we really should actively work on the solution of Austria-Hungary, it is then when they get massively recruited to these state institutions. For example, this Inter-Allied Propaganda Committee, which did such activities as I just mentioned, but also in the Foreign Office, especially in the so-called Crew House, which was the Department of Propaganda in enemy countries, or the Political Intelligence Department. Also in the French case, there were many of these people, mostly geographers, people who knew Slavic languages, and it's important to understand that in Slavic studies in France at that time, there were very little non-Russian specialists, so there was maybe 3 people who knew Czech. So for the Yugoslav case, it was just not so prominent there. They recruited in the in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Quai d'Orsay, in Comité d'études, and they used all this knowledge. They used all these scholars to produce knowledge for the peace conference. So they produced like handbooks for the delegations, how to negotiate, where should the borders of Yugoslavia be exactly, what is the ethnic composition of the population, what are the numbers, so what is the relationship between how many Hungarians or Germans or whatever would be in such Yugoslavia. And after the war, many of these people became the nucleus of the new institutions. For example, School of Slavonic and East European Studies, initially at King's College, today at UCL, which you can see on the right-hand side. And also Institut d'études slaves on the left side, which still exists today in Paris. And both of these are, I would say relatively influential institutions in these countries even today for any matter about, East Central Europe. So it's important also to see where does this knowledge come from, right? It comes from this military or war need to kind of, go around Austria-Hungary. So this is one of the maps, for example, that I found among Seton Watson's papers. Which, you can just see it. It's not the whole, sorry that I didn't fit the whole, but you can see, for example, how it looked, so what was marked, right, the ports, the railways, where would the border go, and so on. You can also see that the border is not exactly as in the end it was finalized, right? So obviously there were some obligations to the London Agreement, to Italy, but at the same time, some things are different, like Baranja, for example. Okay. Just a sec. Okay. So what I wanted to say with this is just how it looked on the inside. So these were the maps that were circulated exclusively in the state institutions like Foreign Office and so on. And then on the next slide, you can see how it looked in all these journals, right? Journals, pamphlets, booklets, all the things that were more widely circulated. So you can see here, for example, also like this is also a very interesting one. The right hand side one is from 1919, which is unbelievable. So this is how a French diplomat imagines Austria-Hungary, which somehow keeps up. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So and you can also see here. So some of these were also published. The right hand side one was published in France, also in certain collaboration with Yugoslav emigres, not exactly part of the Yugoslav committee, some just, like youth studying in Paris at that time, and very Yugoslavist, youth, like modernist poets and so on. And then on the left-hand side, what you see is with this corridor of communication between Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia was one of the solutions at the peace conference to kind of counter the possibility of Austria and Hungary to revise certain agreements or generally to reassert themselves in the region. And it was actually something that was seriously discussed. So such ideas came from this milieu that I'm describing. Now, briefly, key individuals who you can also see on the picture. So the first one, his picture is on the bottom left, who I mentioned already. So Seton Watson was a Scottish historian, right, and journalist also. He spoke several regional languages except Hungarian, and he was most interested in the issues of Hungary, Kingdom of Hungary, right? And he was the founder of the New Europe Society and the Journal, and he was basically the main agitator for the breakup of Austria-Hungary. He was quite rich, and he basically paid everything from his own pocket. He was not at all supported by the British state institutions. Even in 1918, they were lukewarm to his not just ideas, but to his initiatives. And he's not even allowed to join the delegation at the peace conference at all, although everybody is reading New Europe. And they even, the New Europe Society was banned briefly during the war as well, and they, in Britain generally during the war, they limited the consumption of paper at a certain point, and he also felt it because there was just not enough paper or it was crazy expensive, so also the journal really had to fit into this really small format and to cut content and so on. So second one is Wickham Steed. He was a very prominent journalist with very anti-German and anti-Semite stances. He was working at The Times, so very, very prominent newspaper, as a foreign correspondent in Vienna from 1902 onwards. And he really was kind of aware of what's going on in Austria-Hungary. So he really spoke. He even wrote in his biography, in his memoirs, which I don't believe, that he learned Hungarian in 3 months when he was in Budapest, and that he could understand the debates about the constitution. That's just not possible. So I think that nevertheless he was very much listened to, especially at the peace conference and before, and later after the war he became the main editor of the Times, which is also very interesting in the 20s. So then we have Louis Léger. Wickham Steed is on the bottom right. We have Louis Léger, who is on the top left of the slide. He was a quite older generation, actually, French Slavist. He kept very strong ties with, for example, Josip Juraj Strossmayer from the South Slavic space, and he also was very connected to Czech political emigres, and he knew Czech, and he was very much translating many different things and so on. He argued for the dissolution of Austria-Hungary during the war based on his expert authority, so he asserted himself as a Slavist and so on, and cooperated with Ernest Lavis, who was also very, very prominent in these circles and very respected today, not today, but since in Czechoslovakia. And the last one, the top right one, is Pierre Delano, who was a professional diplomat from France. So he was not a scholar at all. I don't think he had any regional knowledge or expertise or anything like that. He nevertheless was quite influential. He published many works, especially travelogues from Serbia before the war, in which he described these very detailed, he had these very long descriptions of life in Serbia, how democratic it is. He constructed this Serbian national characterology, in the sense how Serbs are at the same time very democratic, but also very, combatant, and so on. So I think these images were very much, impressed upon the French public opinion. And he assisted Yugoslav emigres personally and financially. He was also very rich. I, by the way, spoke to his grandson on Skype a few years ago when I wrote this book, and it's a very interesting family, like also diplomatically, and his wife was a very interesting avant-garde figure later in America. So finally, to move on to the ideological part of the story, so this is, I think, the best beginning of Seton Watson's book about Southern Slavic question in Habsburg monarchy, to that Austrian statesman who shall possess the genius and the courage necessary to solve the Southern Slav question. This book is respectfully dedicated. So this is from the time when he still sees the solution of this question within the monarchy, which was for a long time, to be honest, but at some point towards the war, especially with because he's very much following the situation in Hungary, when certain things happen, especially in Croatia, I think he gets, completely, supportive of ideas that go beyond solving this question in the Habsburg monarchy. So here are some of his key books that if you are interested, you should definitely read this. So Racial Problems in Hungary, of course, published under the pseudonym Scotus Viator, right, Scottish traveler, in which he, really in detail dissects the relationship between Hungarians and other nationalities in the Kingdom of Hungary, and the implications of this in terms of democratic representation, but also, generally the corruption within the state system and the Magyarization policies thereat. Then the next one is the Southern Slavic question and the Habsburg monarchy. He published in 1912, where he really has this discourse of it's now or never. So if we don't solve this issue now, this could cause a really big problem for the balance of power in Europe, and it could even cause, armed conflict. He didn't, of course, say a world war, but it is very obvious that for him, this is a big crisis in the monarchy, which he sees as a European crisis. So he sees implications of the Yugoslav question much broader. And a little booklet, Absolutism in Croatia, in which he talks, a lot about this, also constructs a bit this national characterology. And then there are other ones from the war itself. For example, I didn't put it on the slide, but German, Slav, and Magyar, like where he goes into different, characterologies of this nation and how this space should be reformed. So he was initially interested in Germany, and his interest moves towards Austria-Hungary a bit later, so around 1905 or 6 or something like that. And he comes to adopt this discourse of oppressed nationality. So this is his main trope, that in Austria-Hungary, except Germans and Austrian Germans and Hungarians, most other nationalities are oppressed, they don't have democratic representation. And here comes a conceptual change that is really where he really reimagines political modernity in this sense. Of course, he still has this primordial view of nationhood, which is oftentimes actually racially framed, although race is for him used in a different, sometimes it's used in a way in which we would use it today, but sometimes he uses it in a completely different way. I will show it a bit later. And all this actually, racial discourse is based on geographic or environmental determinism. So he oftentimes quotes anthropological or geographical studies from the period, that studies that were just published, for example, by Bertrand Auerbach or Jovan Cvic, where he says that, but that is why, Yugoslavs are so whatever, democratic or not, or I don't know, so heroic, because they live among this mountainous region. So this connection between geography, environment, and national character and affinities towards certain political systems is something that for him is completely just unquestionable. So for him, this is really a firm, it's one story. And he also problematized the issues of democratic representation in connection to population numbers. So disregarding other criteria, disregarding administrative, political traditions of Austria-Hungary, all the other kind of legal frameworks that exist, he actually insists on relating the number of certain people of nationalities to their democratic representation. And he applies this model and tries to portray Austria-Hungary as autocratic, whereas Britain and France are of course more democratic and so on, and he doesn't problematize, of course, the gender question, right? So he is not he never says it, but it is obvious that he never includes women in this. So this is for him also a very social Darwinist thing. So for him, this is about fight between Slavdom and Germandom, which is kind of this, eternal fight to extinction or something. So it's about competition and survival of the fittest, and that's why he kind of constructs it in that way. So this is the most important part. When he talks about oppressed nationalities, of course he talks about what he perceives to be as systemic repression of the groups of nations, right? So for example, Slovaks are his favorite, I would say, or not favorite, but the case which he believes to be most true, which he sees as reasserting themselves. So they are, as I said, oppressed by Magyars or Austrian Germans, Habsburg as well. Instead, view the Jews are also one of the oppressors. So he really sees them and the kind of this, big German Jewish capital as a vehicle for subjugation of Slavs and so on. So that's interesting. Then this oppression, of course, when he tells a story of these peoples, it culminates with the advent of dualism. So he sees this as complete defeat of what should be political position of Slavs within Austria-Hungary, and the corruption behind this dualist framework is actually then revealed through the affairs such as the Fridjungs trial and, of course, Agram high treason trials, or something that happens when he's also there, so he could follow it like daily, in the paper and so on, because he was traveling so much around the space then. And he focuses mostly on Slovaks and Croats, not on others, as pars pro toto of the oppressed nationality. So he applies this model to other Slavs in the monarchy. But my argument is that he does this because this is who he is most connected with. So he doesn't have strong contacts among other political elites in, of course, except the Czechs, naturally, but he doesn't have that many correspondents from, Polish, for example, intellectuals, or, and so on. So I think that his closest collaborators were from Dalmatia, right? So especially those from the Party of Right, so Stranka Prava, who had this special ideology of their own, and then of course the Slovaks. So he was great friend with Hlinka, and I just think that this is why these cases are so represented. And then, of course, he comes up with this principle of nationality, which we today might call national question in retrospect, but for him it was more like a principle in the sense of international law, so also something like principle of self-determination. Sometimes he mentions self-determination, but not that much, so for him it's more about principle of nationality, which for him rather means the realization of this kind of democracy, as I mentioned, so a proportional representation and so on. So that's why he sees a nation state as the only possible democratic state, right? Because this is where no nation rules over other nation and so on. Of course, there are minorities, but they have their own safeguards, they have minority protection treaties and so on. He, of course, juxtaposes democracy in opposition to autocracy or despotism, which he sees especially in the Hungarian and German kind of to be related to their national character. So that this is what they would, I would even say in anthropological terms, this is what they choose. So it's not that they can go beyond that. So it's very important to understand that. And of course, in the other hand, he also connects this idea of democracy to Serbs, right? Because they have this brand new, country which is completely done by the French model and so on. So for him, this is related. And of course, he compares Croatian question to Irish question, which I think is also interesting. And he compares the role of Serbia in the war with the role of Belgium. So that's not something everybody would say. And he conceptualizes Serbia as a healthy democracy, and he awards her the historical role of the liberator of Southern Slavs, right? Showcasing Kosovo as a paradigmatic failure, similarly to Bela Kora in Czech case, and of course he gets very deep into this first uprising mythology, right? He also there were many different ideas of how to actually expand Serbia, right? So from at the beginning of the war, especially in 1915, there is this idea that if something happens, if Austria-Hungary concedes a certain territory, it will then be Greater Serbia. So this was the dominant idea in Britain and France at this, or it was at least propagated. And then, of course, and that was based on the Piedmont of Southern Slavs kind of idea. But towards the second part of the war, we actually see the duality, which persists until the end. And this is the duality between the Yugoslav solution and the Serbian solution. This is when they actually start talking to Pasic and, realizing that, okay, if there will be a Serbian solution, it will be more, like a centralist state, and this will respect some historical legal autonomies or something like that. Or many maps actually show the very, very strong border between the Serbian and the Yugoslav part being the one in the Austria-Hungary. So, this is also conceptually interesting. And, of course, he highlights the homogeneity of Southern Slavs, right, which mainly he supports by language, which is interesting because that's why we talk in English today, right? Because it's not exactly the same language. So nevertheless, for him, linguistic argument is the strongest scientific argument that these are the same people. And of course, he attributes all the difference to the different imperial occupations that happened in this period. And of course, all these scientific claims are always intertwined with the romanticist, nationalist kind of style, of this mythology that I was talking about, but also acceleration of historical time in the sense that, either we solve this now or we will be doomed, or these people will be under some kind of German dominance, and so on. Or in the later part of the war, he's also very much against Serbian kind of dominance in the eventual Yugoslavia. Of course, in this discourse, they also construct themselves in a way that they say that it is British and French mission, right, to support Southern Slavs in realizing this independent statehood and bringing down Austria-Hungary in the name of democracy, Enlightenment ideas, and so on. Yeah, so I don't know, when did we say we need to finish? Just to quickly check, sorry.
5 minutes.
Oh, okay, then I skipped these interesting quotes. No, that's okay. So those who are interested in quotes, I can, of course, send the PowerPoint or just send, or you can also buy my book. So here are some interesting quotes. This is just important to see. So basically, how all these British statistics, and this is also a time of the rapid development of statistics as a field, how they actually differentiate between different groups in Austria-Hungary, and how this is how they present it to the public opinion by saying that, you can see like how many people live in Hungary, how many people are Magyars, who are the others, right? And look at this, for example, Germans, Slavs, Latins, right? If you think about these social Darwinist discourses, this is very, very interesting. And in this case, I just wanted to show you how they lump different things together. For example, how they lump Czechs and Slovaks, and who again live in different parts of the monarchy, and Croats and Serbs and so on. So it's already, statistics is already informed by the expectations of the war goals, right? Political expectations. So that's something interesting. And here are some also quotes, but I might skip them. Here is also something about ante murale Christianitatis, like, Yugoslavs being between civilizational circles of East and West. And something about British and French role, and again, this Drang-nach-Osten or Berlin-Baghdad railway, which was supposed to be realized, is something that they see as a direct threat to British imperial project, which endangers British interests in the Middle East, and also it somehow, in the long term, intends to cut off their ties to India. So in the private correspondence, and this is maybe something I will finish with, is this is what they connect. This is why I say best intentions in the title of the book. If you read the private correspondence between them, you see that for them, this is the biggest concern. The biggest concern is not the liberal ideas, it's not the, oppression of peoples in autocratic Austria-Hungary. Actually, I mean, I'm not saying it's in all correspondence, but in some examples, you can see that they connected to the issue of their economic interests in that part of the world. So, of course, that's why I leave it open-ended. I don't want to say that they were dishonest, because maybe this was something they just used to motivate their political leaders, to explain to the prime minister that this is something that should be done, and they thought this would work better with the prime minister. I can see that, but they also, correspond among themselves talking about this. So, Southern Slavs are Britain's unique friend between Hamburg and Baghdad, and so, yeah. I will maybe leave it at that, yeah, that's it. So just to say that their idea was also to deeply, deeply reconfigure the way international relations are done generally. So to increase transparency, responsibility, to make some kind of, League of Nations, right, that could demilitarize, that could keep peace, that would serve as a platform for peaceful resolution of conflicts. And that would satisfy the principle of nationality, which you can also see on the map. And that's it. Thank you.
Lucija, res najlepša hvala. Bilo je odlično, kljub temu časovnemu pritisku. Jaz mislim, da smo dobili kakšno idejo, so se naučili česa novega, obnovili tudi kakšno znanje o stvarih, ki smo jih morda že kdaj vedeli, pa vmes pozabili. Vsekakor knjigo zelo priporočam. V slovenskih knjižnicah bi se že najbrž našel kakšen izvod, da se pa seveda tudi kupiti in ni posebno draga. Do srede meseca prihodnega je Lucija še v Ljubljani na gostovanju Cepus, tako da čeprav časno kupite knjigo, se lahko še dobite z njo na kavo in vam jo podpiše. Za vprašanje pa po mojem ni časa. No. Meni je zelo žal, bomo ponovili čez par let, ko bodo vse stvari tako delovale, kot je treba in nas ne bodo vrgli ven iz predavalnice, in bomo imeli čas tudi za diskusijo. Še enkrat res najlepša hvala.
Hvala.
Odlično je bilo, hvala.
Da, hvala. Nema veze, sve pet. Mislim, i onako se sve dobro znamo, manje više nije da se odnosno. Da, nema veze.
Meni je žao.
Da, ali događa se, nije problem.
Zamolit ću te za jednu stvar. Daj mi taj PowerPoint pošalj, pa ću ga ja njemu dati.